Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on IT and mental health matters. I'm not going to speak for very long because we've got very limited time this evening. So I'd like to introduce you to Cindy van Wyk. Cindy's a clinical psychologist who also has a master's degree in neuropsychology. She's presented many papers, she's spoken at previous conferences. So we are looking forward to a good evening hearing what Cindy has to say. So I will abandon my post and hand over to Cindy. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you very much, Liz. So I'm going to be talking this evening on the neuroscience and the impact of a screen on the developing brain. We're going to try and do it as quickly as possible to keep it within the 20-minute time slot. And my hope is that we can have a really vigorous discussion around it at the end because it is a very contentious topic. And I think that what COVID-19, if any positive outcome that it's given us, is that at least we are now utilizing technology a lot more and seeing that it actually does have positive sides and not just the negative screen side connotation that we see. So why technology? Why is everybody so worried about it? The realization is that actually children in the 21st century are using technology more and more and more, and we are becoming more and more aware of its possible consequences. Now, in the past, people have mostly focused on how does it affect us psychologically, how does it affect us behaviorally, but the brain and body-based implications of technology use haven't really been extensively studied. In fact, this entire field is kind of still in its infancy. So it's a hot topic, and part of the reason why it's a hot topic is because there are such stringent and restrictive guidelines around screen time and children. And by children, I mean pretty much from birth to 18, well, maybe to 25, depending. So there are very stringent guidelines, and they're very restriction focused, and the research around those restrictions, well, it might seem like it's focused on health in terms of brain health and impact on psychology. Actually, most of the guidelines are based around combating childhood obesity. They're mostly focused on how sedentary and how physical your children are. So we can't take those guidelines and just naturally make them fit towards technology. So it means we have to have a bit of a bigger understanding of what the impact is and what is going on for our kids. So let me use my clicker. There we go. I'm briefly going to talk about postnatal brain development. Dr. Lownie, Claire, is also going to chat about it. So we might overlap a bit, which means I get to talk about it quicker. So when we are born, we have roughly 100 billion brain cells, and each brain cell has roughly 15,000 synaptic connections within each cell. And that sounds massive. And when we're born, our brain weighs approximately 1/4 of what an adult brain weighs. However, by the time we are 3, our brain weighs 3/4 of what an adult brain weighs. And what that is basically, we've heard this old adage that children's brains are like sponges, and it's absolutely true. Because we have something called synaptogenesis, which is this dramatic increase in the number of connections that the neurons make with other neurons, particularly within the first 3 years of life, and with 10-fold within the first year of life. And it means that we have an absolute foundation to build on when children are very young and continuing into adolescence, just before we think that it's only the first 3 years of life that are important, that this is the foundation, and we have to be able to work with what happens during this stage. So the early years are really our most active period for establishing neural connections, and they can form either a very strong or a more weak foundation for connections later on in life. So we start off with these 100 billion brain cells, and by the time we are 3, we have about 1,000 trillion brain connections or synapses. And what happens then is they don't occur equally across all regions. What happens is we have occipital and auditory areas that develop first, obviously, so children can see and hear and interact with their environment that way. And then it moves into our primary somatosensory and motor, so we can start to move and explore our environment through touch and taste, all of those things. And then our association areas and our prefrontal cortex get developed. So it's a bit of a back to front development. What you can see from the following slide is that at birth, we have obviously an enormous amount. By the time we are 6 years old, we have so much. And then something called pruning happens. And again, Dr. Lownie is going to talk about this a bit more. And what happens is we have an old adage that's coined by Hebb a long time ago, which is that synapses that fire together, wire together. And basically what it means is that we selectively prune by doing the same things, by being exposed to the same things, by engaging in certain stimuli and environment. And we take the 1,000 trillion brain cells and synapses, and we prune it down to about 500 trillion. So it's literally halved, and it remains relatively stable into adulthood. This period of pruning and from there into adolescence and into adulthood is really important, because this rapid elimination, which is kind of overabundant in very young brains, is the basic architecture that we're working with. And it's where we have to worry what happens with technology. Does technology interfere in this process in some way? So we have a look, and we have this very early excessive synaptogenesis, then we have pruning and this purposeful sculpting, and it really depends on stimulation and need. And this is going to be the consistent theme across my presentation, which is that the stimulation has to be appropriate and it has to be at specific sensitive periods. Otherwise, we risk having some kind of a deficit, and the need also needs to be met. And the needs are different for different children, but also across different periods of life. So how do we meet these needs? We do something called serve and return, which is your child has a particular need. They express it to you from when they're very young to when they're older. You meet the need, you correctly assess it and respond to it, and then that gives their brain a capacity to really feel like the need has been met, and it gives them an opportunity to sculpt or hardwire these kind of pathways. So a child's early development is really, or at least the quality of it, is determined by the availability of appropriate experiences at the right stages of development, and it will help in determining the strength and the weakness of the brain's architecture, which then obviously later helps determine how well he or she will be able to think and regulate emotions. So we serve and return, and we try and meet our children's needs. And what happens if this is disrupted with technology? So if we think about what is most important, because it can sound very scary and fear-mongering, but nature and nurture obviously both play a role in the development of children and in their adolescent brains, and obviously in their cognitive skills. So measuring these changes and saying, in terms of cognitive skills or brain reorganization, it's definitively not clear-cut, and it doesn't produce these absolute crystal results. So these shock headlines that you read that tout that there's a total restructuring of a child's mind as a result of technology use, they are simply not based on empirical evidence, and they're inaccurate. And I'm hoping today that we can give you a bit of a better grounding in understanding why that is. So, is the concept of technology interfering with typical neural development? Is it technology, or is it the uncertainty of what stimulation children are receiving? And what are they receiving from technology versus what are they receiving from more traditional and researched play and educational methods? Keeping in mind that this area is very lacking in accurate research, I should say. So, background. Children these days are what we call digital natives. So they have grown up with technology. They don't have to learn how to use a new device. They grow with it instead. So for instance, I don't know how many of you watching might be within my particular peer group, but if you remember the internet being introduced, if you remember cell phones coming into use, if you remember home computers becoming important, those are all things we had to learn how to use. Children these days are born into it. They naturally know. Phones are evident and available from day one. So one of the things that we have to talk about is, what do we use technology as a teaching tool, or do we use it as a pacifier? So the effects of technology are not just about the actual use of it, but it's the type of technology and the purpose that we use it for. Are you giving a tablet to a child to pacify them and keep them quiet for 3 hours, or are we using it as part of teaching? And I think we can all relate that COVID-19 has given us the perfect opportunity to use technology, and thank goodness for it. You know, I've had toddlers have Zoom sessions with friends, and for school we've had adolescents and, you know, prepubescent children have school online, we've had work online, we've had to be able to make meetings and social meetings with friends online. So what are we using it for? Okay, so, if we understand that, then we can really group the guidelines around it. In the statistics from the States at the moment are that, quite shockingly I suppose, is that preschoolers tend to have access to technology or digital devices at the moment before they're exposed to books, which can also sound quite shocking. And that the average youth between 8 and 18 spends about an average of 7.5 hours a day engaging with media content, including school. In South Africa, according to a 2018 study, it's more that children in South Africa, obviously from a social economic background where they can afford to do it, spend more than 3 hours a day looking at screens outside of school time. And we have to question what that is. So the current guidelines across the world, kind of generalized, is that there's no screen time for children under the age of 18 months. We have 1 hour of high quality programming per day for up to 5 years, and the term high quality is important there. Thereafter, it's up to 2 hours. And these guidelines were set up to help fight obesity, not necessarily for the effects on the brain. So it means that a lot of societies are advocating for partial or even fully limiting screen time without really knowing what that means and what the effects are. So if we look at skilled versus de-skilled, what it means is that technology has skilled us in certain particular ways, but it's also de-skilled us. So here's a great example. When you were at school and your teacher said you had to learn your timetables off by heart, and she said you have to do that because you're not going to walk around with a calculator every day of your life, and strangely enough, we do, on our phones, on our watches, laptops, everywhere. So it means that things like, what is the direct effect of technology versus what's the effect of its availability? So it means, I think I need to change this one, but it's not working. Okay, one more. There we go. What it means is that a direct effect of technology is, what does this actual technology do to my brain? Whereas availability means things like, okay, I no longer have to do mental mathematics because I have a phone where I can do calculations. So I don't have to make up or figure out the bill at a restaurant. I can just put it into an app and it does it for me. So arguably it doesn't matter. If we have the tools, do we need to do it? But it inadvertently de-skills us, which means we inadvertently lose a particular function that we might want or need later on in life, but doesn't seem necessary right now. So the effects of technology sneak in under the radar, but not because of the technology, because of our behavior around it. So if we look at split attention and direct attention, the more we use technology, we find we use it in these short, very specific, directed, attentive tasks. And we might, especially if they become much more repetitive, the more we use the neural pathway, obviously, like we've been saying, the more it fires together. So overall, positive, in terms of research, positive stuff has come out saying that, for instance, experienced Googlers have much broader brain activity, particularly in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, than, say, internet naive people. And we're kind of developing this neural circuitry for very rapid and incisive spurts of directed attention, and we can have improved complex reasoning and problem solving. But on the other hand, the more you multitask, the less deliberative you become. So the less you are able to think out and reason about a problem. And this can also result in a difficulty in concentrating on books or long articles, which obviously might be difficulty in school as well or at work. You can become more easily distracted because if you have 16 tabs open and there's an advert popping up every 5 seconds, how do we stay focused? You can become more impulsive. You can go down a YouTube rabbit hole, and you can have thinking that becomes kind of more staccato. We're less able to follow a flow, and we're more chopped in the way that we think about things. So a lack of concentration in general is one of the big concerns. But there really is an absolute lack of in-depth research and knowledge, particularly in the past 10 years, that shows how technology plays a role in children's learning, especially across the different developmental domains. I think learning in particular is a very popular one. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go really quickly. And essentially, it comes down to the fact that it has to be moderated. There has to be an absolute interaction of 3 things. Adults have to mediate between children and technology. So it's not that technology is the bad guy here, it's how it gets used. So we have to strike a balance between, and it means that we have to have adult facilitated technology. So the influence of technology on children's brains and learning is absolutely conditional. All right, it's a typology, and it's a complex relationship across 3 domains. And until we know that there's this reciprocal interplay, then we're never going to understand exactly what it means. So to move very quickly through it, because I only have 5 minutes left, one of the most researched areas is TV. And I think everybody used to worry, you know, my child's sitting at home watching too much TV. Now we worry that they're sitting at home watching too much stuff on their phone or their iPads or their tablets. And there's been lots of research, and I'll leave it up. I'm not going to go through it here necessarily because we don't have time, but you can see that there's always going to be a negative result. However, interestingly, is that there's positive results as well. And the real positive results for TV is that actually there are greater levels of school readiness in preschoolers who watched Sesame Street on a regular basis, as well as having superior language development. Educational shows also increase language use and vocabulary development. If we have good educational content, then it can help families that are from a low socioeconomic status that don't have access to extracurricular work or teachers. It can also help. There's a positive relationship between, again, education informative TV and reading for leisure later in life. So there's an absolute interplay between the quality of the media and what you're exposing children to and the positive outcome from it. The same goes for gaming. Yes, there's reward pathways. Yes, people worry a lot about gaming, but actually there's a lot of sensory motor coordination and control, and I'm skipping through a lot, I'm sorry, that goes on around it. People have shown that if you play a lot of Tetris, it helps integrate visual, tactile, auditory, and physiological information. There's a lot of visual word form maturation for people that play video games, and it is involved in mediating literacy. One really interesting outcome is that surgeons, and this might be very interesting to people in general, surgeons who played video games for a few hours a week made fewer mistakes in an operating theatre than those who didn't. And because they think games quickened their spatial intelligence and facilitated kind of collaborative problem solving. So we think that it has all of this negative background to it, but actually it can really help in decision making, enhancing attention, better working memory, spatial skills, and empathy. So we don't necessarily have time to go through everything, but it is, again, what are they gaming with? What are they doing? An empathy game can help build empathy, but what is it that they're actually playing, and are you involved in what that means? Same goes for social media, and I know that I'm going to be out of time in about 2 minutes. So I'm just going to talk quickly about pretty much what it means. And again, it's about psychology, suppose more than brain alterations, which is that, does it affect our poor quality of sleep? Does it make us anxious or depressed if we don't get the right amount of likes? Again, the research is in its infancy, and it's shown that social media, increased exposure to social media, can have a negative impact in that it has superficial, less reflexive, and less critical thinking, and potentially an impact on empathy. So I would say the key issues to consider are always, there's no definitive research that proves that it has a neurobiological impact, the actual technology itself, but more that it's around what's our behavior with technology. Do we use it to pacify our children? Do we use it as an educational tool? Do we de-skill ourselves by relying on the technology? Or do we use it to upskill ourselves, like everybody's had to do during lockdown and figure out how to use Zoom or Skype or whatever? So we have to worry if there's a drop in terms of our active versus passive engagement with people, with social. We can't consider this as a way to, technology can't be a babysitter. It has to be something that is, again, facilitated by adults. So if you are involved in the technology use with your children, that makes a considerable difference. When do we worry? We worry if technology use is causing impairment, if a person is unable to function without it, is there a dependency? And we worry if they are starting to avoid or disengage from other forms of life, because technology has to be an aspect of our life, not our entire life. And research suggests we need to plan healthy limits, include screen time and technology in the 24 hours that you plan around your child's day. Physical activity is incredibly paramount. So if technology can be incorporated into that, like a watt bike, go for it. But we need to be out and we need to be doing it. And the main thing, is it beneficial? I think we've all learned that teaching can benefit from it and has had to, particularly in terms of digital schooling, and that's incredibly important. But what are we doing at home with regards to children's sensitive periods? Are we stimulating them enough, or are we handing it off to technology? So are you a facilitator or an enabler? And that was very, very quick. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I apologize to everyone for the speed of the presentations tonight. Originally, these were meant to be 1 hour long presentations that had been CPD accredited, and we had to ask our presenters at the last minute to shorten them and make them webinar friendly so that we didn't have everybody spending many, many hours listening to something. So thank you very much for shortening it. We're going to be keeping the questions to the very end, so I would like to now ask our speakers to swap over. Do we need to do the little touch clue? COVID is a new way for us all. As you can see, it's becoming second nature. Is it working? Okay. There we go. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Claire Lownie. Claire is a specialist psychiatrist with an additional Masters of Science degree in emergency medicine. She's also a very accomplished speaker and has presented many papers all over the place. Once again, I'm not going to say much more about Claire because her time has also been shortened. So I'm going to hand over to you, Claire. Thank you very much.
Liz. Okay, so thank you everybody for having me tonight. I will also try and keep this as short as possible. I have been given the rather unenviable task of talking about the harm that screens can do. Unenviable because I think that Cindy has just very nicely told us of the good that screens have done for us this year, and I think we've all had to experience that firsthand. But there is no doubt that uncensored and unmonitored, there is a lot of harm that can be done to our children and our adolescents if we don't keep a strict eye on things. So I'm just going to bring your awareness to some of what is going on behind the scenes in terms of what's going down with the screen time. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what is the big deal about screen time, including an introduction in terms of a little bit of an overview of brain development, the important chemicals that we are dealing with in terms of the brain. And then I'm going to take a bit of a biopsychosocial approach to screens to have a look at what are the possible harms that can be done in terms of screens. Have a bit of a look as to when and why we should worry. And then I've got a few screen time guidelines and suggestions. And then, like Liz said, at the end, if there's time, we will have a bit of a discussion and possibly some time for questions. So essentially, what is the big deal about screen time? So, oops, jumping ahead of myself. So in terms of a brief overview of brain development, the development of the brain starts at about 3 weeks in utero after conception, and that's when the development of the neurons or the nerve tissue actually starts. And that continues until 20 weeks in utero, where you have got your full complement of nerves. And the development of nerves is really actually quite unexciting. That's not the important part of the brain tissue. Not that the neurologists would agree with me, but psychiatrists are far more concerned with the synapses or the connections between the nerves, which then starts happening from about 20 weeks onwards. And by birth to roughly 18 months, you have got 75% of your synapses that have started or that have developed. By approximately 6 years of age, you have got 90% of your synapses. And by 11 years of age, you have got this pristine, exciting brain that looks roughly like the inside of Buckingham Palace. And that is the most pristine and the most number of synapses that the brain is ever going to have. From the age of 11 years to roughly the age of 25 years, a process called pruning starts to happen. And this is essentially a cutting away of the synapses that have not been used and not been reinforced during those first formative years. And that process is roughly akin to taking the Buckingham Palace brain that you've got, smashing down all the rooms that have never been used and completely re-renovating the rooms that have been used. So it is essentially quite important during those very early years to be stimulating the correct synapses so that when you re-renovate Buckingham Palace, you are using the correct rooms so that when you have the finished product, you are not ending up with a sewer and a laundry and some really unexciting rooms in Buckingham Palace. Okay. Just to run through some of the important brain chemicals and their functions. The first chemical that I've got up there is dopamine. Dopamine is the brain chemical that is responsible for our pleasure reward pathway. It is the one that is intricately involved in addiction. So this is the one that is really quite strongly implicated in gaming, gaming addictions, porn addictions, various different types of addictions. So it can be quite a problematic brain chemical in the brain, especially if gaming is developed at an early age and then not closely monitored. Serotonin is our mood and our anxiety molecule. A deficiency of serotonin almost invariably leads to depression, and an imbalance of serotonin leads to an anxiety disorder. Adrenaline and noradrenaline, also intricately related to anxiety. They are responsible for the fight-flight system in the brain and are very often associated with the kind of television shows, games, etc. that promote severe levels of anxiety and things such as first-person shooter games, which require large amounts of adrenaline to be put out at a moment's notice. Oxytocin is the love hormone. That is what causes babies to attach well to their mothers. It is also what is implicated in the attachment to social media platforms such as Facebook. And it has quite an important role to play in the development, or lack thereof, of empathy. So it has a role to play in social media, and possibly the role of social media is linked to some kind of a problem with oxytocin. GABA is the substance that is responsible for our sleep, and so problems surrounding GABA very often result in insomnia or sleeping disorders of some sort. And then the endorphins and the endocannabinoids are the morphine derivatives and the cannabis derivatives in our brain systems, and they are they are responsible for pain control and for pleasure, and also to a certain extent for certain types of addictive pathways and behaviors. And they are also intricately related to certain types of gaming. So the net results can have quite significant impacts on the cognitive functioning. So that's your thoughts, your higher functions, your motivations, your thinking, your academic behaviors, your emotional functioning, and then your physical behaviors as well. So, with regards to our biopsychosocial approach to screens, I've started off with a little case study about this phenomenon that the Japanese called hikikomori. It's known as a pulling inward or a being confined. I did originally put this presentation together before COVID. I would like to just point out, I think this could have applied to pretty much most of us on around about the 15th of April this year. But essentially what happens is that affected individuals isolate themselves. They don't interact. They very often don't leave a room for at least 6 months. And as you can see from the picture in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, this individual has got leftovers, he's got his books, he's got his takeaways, he's got his clothes, he's got all sorts of stuff lying around his room. He just hasn't actually moved from the confines of his bedroom for essentially a very long time, and he has been completely and totally involved in gaming and on his screens for the duration of that time. It tends to have a cultural basis in this particular context, although not exclusively, and from a mental perspective is closely related to post-traumatic stress disorder and autism spectrum disorder, which is a communication-based disorder, and is often related to social and academic failure. So from the biological perspective, some of the negative effects that unmoderated screen time can have, as Cindy mentioned earlier, inactivity leading to obesity and all of the complications that surround obesity and inactivity, the ongoing stimulation of the brain and constant exposure to blue light can negatively affect sleep, causing insomnia and other sleep disorders, and can cause severe neurochemical imbalances. From a psychological perspective, we are looking at dependence on screens, particularly in the gaming context and in the social media context. There is this dependence on instant gratification. No delayed gratification. You go on to Tinder, and if you like, you swipe one way, and if you don't like, you swipe the other. If you want to buy something, you go onto Amazon or whatever the platform is that you happen to choose, and 48 hours later it arrives at your gate. There is absolutely no need to wait for anything. It is impulsivity at its very best. With regards to empathy, it doesn't really apply, because on social media you can like somebody, you can unlike them, you can unfriend them, you can do what you want, and you never actually have to deal with the in-person consequences of your actions, because you're on the other side of a screen and you don't have to deal with the real life, real time events of what your actions and what the things that you say and do can have. And then also the exposure to certain content, and I will go into this slightly more later on, particularly with certain trends and with regard to self-harm. There is a lot more access, and I'm seeing it a lot in my practice at the moment, is that children are finding very, very ingenious ways to harm themselves at the moment, and they're getting access to this almost exclusively online. In the social context, there is a lot of cyberbullying that is happening. There is almost not a week that goes by where I don't see some kind of cyberbullying from the social media aspects. And very often this is not picked up, and children are too ashamed to report it to parents or teachers or other responsible adults because they are not supposed to have been accessing the content that they're accessing in the first place. So they allow it to carry on unnoticed until such time as we are dealing with a very severe mental disorder and or significant self-harm. As you can see from the photo on the right, there is a distinct lack of social skills developing around the misuse of social media. There is a certain sense of entitlement when it comes to unmonitored screen time. I'm entitled to my screen time, not screen time is a privilege that I have been granted. And then there is also the risk of not knowing who the children and the adolescents are talking to at the end of the day. When it comes to screen time and self-harm in children, I have been getting children as young as 8 years old who have researched and been able to take overdoses on some fairly high-level medications, usually medications that are prescribed for older relatives, particularly parents, aunts, uncles, things like antidepressant medications, cardiac medications. They research how to cut themselves. There is also the risk of these online challenges, some of which have been shown to be hoaxes, but unfortunately, as many of them as there are hoaxes, they seem to crop up some kind of a counter to the hoax where the kids think, well, yes, it was a hoax, but let's just go and try some of these things anyway. And they set up little squads at school where they go and try some of the things that were allegedly part of the hoax. And particularly in the wake of COVID, where things have been quite distressing, the instances of self-harm have been increasing dramatically in the last few weeks. So essentially, when and why to worry is the children have got, at the moment, almost uncensored access to media because they've had to learn online. Very often they are able to find ways around the safety and privacy settings that have been put there. Very often they are able to outthink or outwork the technology that the parents have put in place. They are unable to comprehend the need for balance, and they don't, even if they have the support that they require, often access the support that they feel that they need. With the theories of no bullying policies, they often feel too ashamed to go and access the anti-bullying policies that have been in place. And there is very little fact-checking that goes on and very little prudence that is exercised when it comes to looking at people, even strangers. I've got kids in the practice who are talking to people 3-4 times their age without having done any kind of background check. Oh no, this one is my friend, I met him online, you know, I'd like to go down to Cape Town and meet him in a few months' time. And the parents are nearly doing cartwheels by the time they find out about this kind of thing. Okay. So with regards to some general suggestions and guidelines, one suggestion would be to make individualized family plans, because very often it is not only up to one or up to consideration of one family member. There are more than one children, or there is more than one child in the household. This web link that I've put here is from the American Pediatric Association, where they actually have quite a nice calculator where you can type in all the different children's ages and requirements and schooling and that sort of thing, and that will help to individualize the family plans with regards to screen time. However, as Cindy said earlier, a lot of the individualized plans are based on physical restrictions rather than brain-based and mental restrictions. Treat the media as you would treat any other aspect of the child's life. So it cannot be a completely exclusive thing. You wouldn't expect the child to spend all day every day doing schoolwork. You wouldn't expect the child to spend all day every day in a gym or on a sports field. Likewise, don't expect or allow the child to spend all day every day sitting on a screen. Set limits and use the limits, especially for younger children. Encourage proper playtime away from screens, and screen time shouldn't be alone time. It should be monitored by a responsible adult who can answer questions that the children have and who can moderate the content. Value face-to-face communication and screen-free time. Have tech-free zones, particularly bedrooms should be tech-free completely. Set the example for the children, and if I can give one bit of advice, is know your child. Not so much what your child is watching or the parental controls that have been put on the screen, but the child, him or herself, because if you know your child well, then you will know when something is going wrong. The minute the child's behavior changes, that is an indication that something is not right, and that is when you can start intervening and picking up on what's going on. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lownie. There have been a couple of questions that have come in. I think you've answered them, but I'm going to ask both yourself and Cindy if you'd like to answer again. Cindy, would you like to come sit here and I'll ask from the side? Thank you. Okay. So one question that came through was if parents put in more structured play, such as puzzles and various other mental activities, or structured outdoor activities, will this counter some of the de-skilling that you mentioned earlier?
No, not necessarily. So they'll be learning skills through those particular activities as it is. I think the de-skilling when we talk about technology is how we rely on technology to do things for us that we then feel like we don't have to do ourselves. So my example is like trying to add up in your mind or trying to remember phone numbers or addresses, but it goes beyond that. So I actually think creating structured times to do things like puzzles and play outside is wonderful and should be very highly encouraged across the board.
Okay, the other question that came in, would a screen protector or screen saver prevent the blue light from interfering with a person's sleep pattern?
Essentially, no. It mitigates it to some extent, but no, it doesn't. So my recommendation is that all screens should be off at least 90 minutes before bedtime, and you should be doing something else for those 90 minutes before bed to kind of bring the brain down, start getting ready for bed. Read a book, a proper book, not an e-book.
Okay, and then the last question that came in was, other than more direct parent involvement, what else can parents do if they are busy with their own careers to ensure that screen time is balanced?
I'll start if you want to after it.
Go for it.
I think that you can be very aware and in touch. Again, it's about controls around what is the quality of the stuff that they are looking at. So everybody, unless I'm mistaken, works in some way, shape or form. So as long as you are aware that the quality of what it is that your children are engaging with is appropriate. Obviously, everybody has times when they want to sit and just zone out for a bit. And that is the whole entire basis of Netflix's business plan, I'm sure. But what we need for the rest of the time is to know that we are actually growing. We can't just be sitting and passively engaging with something. So try and find stuff that they can actively engage with, because using technology is it's not something to shame people with at all. It's such an important part of our lives. So let's rather just make it appropriate and quality content, and then we're A for away.
Agreed.
Okay. I have no more questions other than some statements, and the statements were saying thank you for such comprehensive and useful information, and that is coming in various formats. So thank you both.
And very quick.
There is another one. This one was, do blue light glasses work?
Same way for the screen protectors. Yeah. It's
okay, and then there is another one. I allow my child 2 hours a day on Minecraft and Roblox only, but don't sit and interact with him. He is 7. Is that wrong? Should I be playing with him? This is not possible. Playing with him is not possible.
So be very careful about using the word wrong. Again, we don't want to guilt people and we don't want to shame them. Roblox is fantastically educational. Minecraft, I can't quite wrap my head around, but I hear it's wonderful. So
I don't have a huge issue with either of them.
No,
I prefer at the age of 7 to be slightly less than 2 hours. But yeah.
But international guidelines do say from 7 up you can have 2 hours. Again, it is related to childhood obesity. So if he's doing it, and it's a very creative game. They're both, very kind of technical. Don't shame, don't have guilt, but if he can maybe spend an hour playing those and an hour
doing something physical.
Yeah, doing something physical, then make what are those things?
Lego.
Thank you. Lego, something like that, like actual physical Roblox.
Okay. Well, from my side, there are no more questions. So I would just like to thank you both very much once again for editing your original presentations and for being available here tonight. And I would like to ask the guests who can't see me, but they can hear me, we will be sending out a survey link. If you could please complete it to give us some feedback on your experience of this webinar. I'm not too sure quite if we are over time. I think we're a little bit under time, but I would imagine that most people are quite happy with that. Okay. I'm going to just allow the two of you, if you'd like to say one closing statement, and then we will end the session.
I would say, well, first of all, thank you for having me very much. I would say there's so much that you can do with technology. It's not the enemy, it's just how we use it. Try not to feel too much guilt and shame, just rather focus it on quality content, and that's going to be the way forward.
Yeah, 100%. It's definitely not the enemy. It's very much how we use it, and please use responsibly.
Okay, thank you both very much. Good night, everyone. Please join us for our next webinar on the 26th of November. The information will also be emailed to our parents as a link. Thank you all.
Thank you.